Welcome everybody to the London Futurist Hangout on Air on the subject, Will Science and Technology Save the World? My name's David Wood. I have the pleasure of chairing London Futurists, and in a few minutes I'm going to be introducing a range of panelists who've each got a lot of thought about the powers and capabilities of science and technology, and also perhaps the risks and issues that these capabilities bring. But to set the scene, I'm going to run through just a few techno-optimistic ideas as to the capabilities of science. So let me get my slides showing again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by asking the question, who has saved the most human lives in history? Is it individual charity workers, or is it entrepreneurs? Well, spoiler alert, I'm taking some data from a website called scienceheroes.com that I was led to recently by listening to the audiobook by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, in which he gives pretty much a techno-optimistic view of the possibilities of human improvement. In this site, Science Heroes, it looks at people such as the discoverers of penicillin, which has transformed lots of medical practice. It estimates in various ways that this group of people have saved at least 91 million lives. That sounds like a big number, but when you bring in the team that developed the measles vaccine, conquered a disease which used to spread lots of havoc, that saved arguably 134 million lives, that in turn is topped by the people who in recent times in various ways led to the eradication for most practical purposes of smallpox. All scientists, medical practitioners, technologists, engineers. There's more on the list that saved even more lives. And it's arguably tragic that we tend to know so little about these people. This pair here, Lynn Enslow and Abel Woolman, are credited at saving 189 million lives by their work in 1919 to come up with a safe mechanism to chlorinate water. And up to that time, city water supplies were often unintended carriers of diseases such as typhoid, cholera, and dysentery. But as a result of the water being purified, most of these diseases were much less prevalent. And this has been called by Life magazine at the end of the last century in an article, probably the most significant public health advance of the millennium. Even that has been topped by work of Norman Borlaug, who in painstaking experimentation in the 1940s and 1950s came to be known as the father of the Green Revolution, breeding wheat that was disease resistant and would grow in difficult environments, essentially feeding large parts of the population which previously were either in a state of famine or malnourishment and stunted growth. And it's said that today, his wheat provides roughly 23% of the world's calories, total lives saved upward of 300 million. That's still not the number one on this list from Science Heroes. We can look at Edward Jenner, who as long ago as 1796 was the person who noticed that although there were smallpox diseases, cattle farmers tended to be immune to them, and he figured out that by making a vaccine from this cow variant of smallpox, known as cowpox, he could prevent people from dying from smallpox. He's credited as saving nearly 600 million lives, and there is data from all kinds of places showing that, for example, here in Sweden, in decades leading up to 1800, smallpox deaths were responsible for maybe 6,000 out of every million in population. In the decades following 1800, when this vaccination system was introduced against a lot of obstacles, it can be said that figure had fallen to 420 per million. Is that the top of the list? Well, there's another couple of names here, Carol Landsteiner and Richard Lewison, whose work in the early years of the last century discovered more about blood groups and blood clotting, and thereby enabled safe blood transfusions, completely transforming how medicine works. And they're credited at saving more than 1 billion lives by this responsibility. And the very highest figure in the list is from Fritz Haber and Carol Bosch, It's possible that some of you may have heard about them from your education. In around about 1909, the two of them developed a mechanism to fix nitrogen out of the air and synthesize ammonia, which is the basis for fertilizers, that revolutionized agriculture in a very profound way, allowed much more efficient growing of food, and total lives saved nearly 3 billion. So that's a great story as to what's been accomplished by science. And what we're here to discuss today is who will save the most lives in history going forwards. Will it be the developers of systems of abundant green energy, possibly developers of low-cost water desalination, possibly developers of healthy lab-grown meat, developers of therapies to deal with one of the causes or worseners of many diseases, namely aging? Or will it be the people who develop big data, machine learning, and artificial general intelligence, which can in turn improve all of the above development processes? In other words, shouldn't we be encouraging everybody become more scientifically minded in technology? Shouldn't we be encouraging people to take up these as careers? And that's the thing that has done most to improve human life. So that's what we're going to be discussing in this group. And I'd like to kick off this discussion by coming to Nikola Danaylov, whose views I think can be summed up by this very interesting cartoon that's on a blog post on his site. Nikola, as most of you will know, is the host of one of the world's most interesting and most widely followed blogs on exponential technologies. Nikola, if I can ask you to introduce yourself and give your opening thoughts as to what's wrong with the view that science and technology will save the world? If I ask you to come off mute, Nikola.
Hi, everybody. The article that David Wood mentioned has been published some time ago and created a lot of emotions in my readership. But basically, the idea is very simple, in my opinion, and in some way commonsensical one. So first of all, science and technology don't have any agency of their own. And therefore, it is the scientists and the technologies that ought to take the credit or ought to bear the responsibility, whether we save life or we take it. So, for example, take the example of Dr. Fritz Haber that David Wood mentioned as potentially saving 1.2 or 3 billion people. Well, he also killed millions of people by not being ashamed for 1 second to develop mustard gas in World War I and other weapons of mass destruction. So you see, the same science can be used for good and for evil, and science and technology do not possess any agency of their own, but it is the scientists and the technologies who make that ethical choice as to whether it will be applied in a particular way, which then can have good or evil implications. And therefore, the claim that I'm making forward is that we ought to simply take responsibility for the outcomes, whether it's a good one or whether it's a bad one. And we cannot blame science and technology for it, or we cannot expect science and technology to come and save us. We are the agents, we have the opportunity, and we bear the responsibility.
So you're a fan of scientists and technologists who apply ethical principles?
Of course, I am a fan, and which is why I've been doing what I've been doing for the last 10 years, which is a blog on science and technology, but primarily with ethical stress and focus, because technology is not enough. It never is. Technology is very necessary. It's a must. Our civilization cannot survive without technology, but it is insufficient. So, for example, we have all the technology today to not kill any sentient beings anymore on our planet. And yet we kill 75 billion animals and 1.3 trillion fish and other aquatic organisms. We don't do that because we're starving. We do that because it's our habit to do so. We don't need calories from them. We don't need to enslave them, and we don't need to kill them. Yet we do that because of our habits and our traditions. Likewise, we have all the science and technology for no human being to be starving in the world today, anywhere. And yet, we have an obesity epidemic in the West, and we still have tens of millions of people starving in Africa and in other places, which is going to show, I think, very clearly that it's not just a matter of having the science and the technology, or the food in this case, but it's about how you apply it, how you use it, how you distribute it, and whether people have access to it.
Many thanks, Nikola. We'll pick up these points of discussion more in a moment, but let's continue letting the panelists introduce themselves. I'd like to come to Jay Friedenberg, who is a professor of psychology at in Manhattan College in New York. And I gather, Jay, you sometimes describe yourself as a bit of a techno-optimist. What's your view on what you've heard so far?
Oh, yeah, I would say I'm most definitely a techno-optimist. I mean, I'm not going to disagree that right now humans make decisions about how technology is used. But I think going forward and looking at current developments in technology now, we're seeing that for the first time in history, technology is now enabling us to change our own human nature. So up until this point, it's been people making decisions about how technology is supposed to be used, but we're now using technology in terms of genetic engineering, in terms of brain-machine interfaces that are allowing us to make ourselves more intelligent and more ethical. Okay, so I think the debate going forward is going to be how do we change our if we should change our own nature and how we change our own nature, because if we become more ethical and if we use computers to understand how ethics works, which is this new emerging field of super ethics, and if we make machines that are themselves more capable of reasoning ethically, and those machines are making decisions, or we are augmented in this kind of fashion and making better decisions, then technology now has enabled us to act and to become better. So I think
can you give us an example, can you give me an example where science or technology has made us more ethical, as you just said?
Well, if you look at intelligence, we've got genetic engineering. There have been a number of studies looking at using gene editing methods where you can alter the gene that codes for the protein receptor dopamine, which is used in the hippocampus. And so they've made, for example, rats that are better able to run mazes, better able to do problem solving and so forth. So there's no reason why we can't apply that same technology to ourselves. That's an example of intelligence. Where we see ethics at work is more with machines, the field of machine ethics, and using machines to reason in ways that are more moral and more ethical. So we're sort of just at the start of this, but it's inevitable in my mind.
Will you be happy, Jay, once military machines, military robots or drones have got ethics programmed into them locally, rather than referring ethical decisions to groups of humans to arbitrate?
Well, I mean, the thing is, if we can engineer super ethics, either in ourselves or machines or in some sort of like biological, technological symbiosis, then we won't have war. I mean, because war is a failure of ethics. So if we're doing ethics right, then we won't be in that situation in the first place. However, this issue of using autonomous machines to fight obviously suffers from some of the same problems of any kind of technology. It can be hacked. It can be turned against us. Just one other thing to that point is that people have said, people like Max Tegmark and in the Future of Life group that he started are trying to ban intelligent machines from being used for military purposes. And in fact, this could end up being a problem because if the United States, for example, or some Western European nations stop developing these things, then rogue nations will. And it's going to be a catch-up game. So if we get into that position, I think it's going to be very difficult to stop development from going forward. But but as I said, I would be very happy to see us not get to the point where we eliminate war. So, and if you look at Steven Pinker's work, just one more point, you'll see, right, in fact, that war has been trending downwards, and that may be in part due to increased communications and trade and so forth that's been enabled by technologies.
Kim Solis, maybe I can add you to the discussion at this point. So you are a professor with a background in various types of medicine, and you are at the University of Edmonton in Alberta. What's your view on what you've heard? And I notice you've got a couple of advisors behind you. Are they ready to help you have the discussion on super ethics?
Yes, so I teach a course on technology and the future of medicine, and these large robot cutouts are kind of the symbol of the course. And so I've been teaching that course for 7 years, and I guess it naturally leads me to think there's only really one answer here, which is the full spectrum of outcome is always possible, but we are not passive victims of the future. So we can shape the future. We can help determine whether one outcome is more possible than the others. So, technology could do wonderful things in the future. It could do terrible things. I think that it could end up anywhere in between in that spectrum. So rather than just thinking that we're going to sit back and wait to see what happens and predict what's going to happen, we can actually influence that, looking at specific scenarios, bifurcation points. That's the reason that I sent that State of the Future, those graphics this morning. I think we could, increasingly look at wildcards, bifurcation points, so that everybody's familiar with that.
Could you just say a bit more about the work of the State of the Future?
In a positive way.
Could you just say more about the analysis of the State of the Future?
Right.
I quite like it because it seems to have a right mix of optimism and realism, and pointing out things, metrics which are getting worse rather than just the metrics that are getting better.
So it's even better than that, because every human being has the opportunity to take part in writing the next version of the book. It comes out with a new version of the book, The State of the Future, every year. And there's an email address and where you can contribute to the next version. So the 2017 one is the one that I sent you those graphics from. And each year they pick one country to feature. So they featured Pakistan in 2017. So there's sort of a detailed analysis of where future parameters in all sectors of human activity are stacking up in 2017, and then how Pakistan stacks up against that. And in the course, it works particularly well because it's current, and also the students don't get this feeling of just top down, that somebody's telling them something. They realize if they work hard, they can actually be part of the 2018, 2019 book. And so it's quite different from an ordinary book, which only comes out once and which you cannot influence. This is something that you can help to write. And no matter what area of future you're interested in, there's something about it in there, including things that you'd find very, unpleasant to think about, like bioterrorism, the future of war, and so on. But whatever your special interest, you will find it in that book, and you can become a part of it. So this is a project of the Millennium Project, and it's their book. So that is the state of the future. They're currently on volume 19. They began this activity in 1996, and I think it would be good for more people to know about this and for more people to personally contribute to the book.
So if people Google Millennium Project, they can find that. I want to bring in at this stage the final panelist who hasn't had a chance to speak yet, Seth Weisberg, who is based in Texas, the neuroscientists. Seth, I'm sure you've got lots of views on what you've heard already. Maybe why don't you introduce yourself and share your top of mind thoughts?
Yes, many views. So I'm Seth Weisberg. I'm currently a humble graduate student at University of Texas at Austin's Department for Neuroscience. I study the cellular basis of learning and memory, and I would consider myself a humanist first, optimist, definitely, pretty much across all categories that one can be optimistic about, and skeptic. I'm very skeptical in general. As to technology and its ability to save the world, I would submit a few things. First, to Nikolai's point about Fritz Haber inventing mustard gas as well as the nitrogen fixation process. All of these things, all of these technologies are tools, as he correctly stated, and tools have no agency, only humans do. So inventing mustard gas is no more morally objectionable than creating the nitrogen fixation process. It's the people who decide to use whatever that are morally accountable for these things. So ethics is really of the utmost importance. Human hands are capable of killing just as easily as they are capable of healing or helping. And technology, like anything else, is just a tool, and tools are used to amplify our innate abilities, be they physical, as in lifting heavier things, or mental, since the first person scratched down the few markings on a clay tablet, and we've expanded our memory from our brains to the outside world. And the technology that existed in the beginning with the species, or with the genus Homo, going all the way back to 3 million years with the very first hand axe and the very first writing, is qualitatively no different than the most current technology that exists, just quantitatively different. Increases our power over nature.
As there's more power, as this technology is more capable, doesn't it make it even more important that we have better ethical systems? Because a mistake in the past might have killed a small number of people. A mistake today might kill huge numbers.
And precisely on this one, I want to take some issue here with what Jay said. Seth said that technology is a tool and can be used for good or for evil. That's exactly what I was saying too, of course. And therefore, the key is an ethical choice. I would even go to argue it's a political choice now in our system that we live in, because the future of politics is technology, and technology is the future of politics. But also because I'm not aware of a single speck of evidence where technology or science has actually helped us make a better ethical decision. Let me talk about that example with the rats. First of all, of course, we're not rats. But secondly, the very instrumentative value that the rat can solve a maze much faster means nothing about whether it's a problem worth solving in the first place. And I want to read you a quote by Arthur C. Clarke, who said, "Before you become entranced with gorgeous gadgets and mesmerizing video displays, let me remind you that information is not knowledge, knowledge is not wisdom, and wisdom is not foresight. Each grows out of the other, and we need them all." So this example with the rat solving a maze or any other technological enhanced capability that we lacked before is simply at the level of either information or knowledge. Ethics is about wisdom. It's about if and how we can best apply that knowledge to get the best possible outcome, and whether we should be engaged in that activity in the first place or not, right? So I am not aware of any examples where technology has helped us be more ethical, but I'm happy to be shown otherwise.
I guess, Nikola, the issue is that technology might make us smarter and more intelligent, more informed, but none of that means that we're more likely to use that wisdom, that information for better ethical reasons. We could use it for our own selfish or xenophobic or tribalistic reasons. Jay, what's your response to that? Can you point to any evidence that technology might make us not just smarter, but also more ethical and more amenable to building a positive society?
Yeah, so just a couple of comments. I want to say, first of all, that intelligence and ethics are not unrelated. I think that the applied use of intelligence to solve ethical problems results in the generation of a more ethical society. So, for example, if you think of ethics as a computational problem, for example, in law, you can have a very formally defined sort of field in which you can say this is what a desired outcome. So if you have a problem, I mean, ethics is a problem, and intelligence can be used to solve problems. And the more formally structured the problem is, for example, in law, then the easier it is to use computational methods to solve those kinds of problems. And I mean, I don't want to digress into details of whether or not rat models are good examples that can generalize results to human subjects, but just generally make the comment that if you're going to make anything more intelligent and you use that intelligence and apply it to ethics, then the result is that you're going to, have a society that's more ethical. It has to be applied, of course. You have to understand what ethics is, but then you have to apply it.
Let me take a huge challenge to that position, because you see, Albert Einstein was living in the community of the smartest people in the world. He was thoroughly disgusted that most of his colleagues saw no contradiction with their scientific intellect, with their incredibly top-ranking world level of intelligence, joining overnight the nationalistic fervor of Germany, either in World War I or in World War II, and killing millions upon millions of people. And in fact, he was so repulsed that he, gave away his German passport. He didn't want to be German anymore, and all those kinds of things. And we see the cream of the crop, and the scientific center of the world, especially in World War I, was Berlin, was Germany. And yet that didn't help in any way to either avoid the war or to help it in any way possible, or to be any more merciful or compassionate. So I don't see any correlation. My own personal observation from when I was in the army, by the way, because there used to be a time when I was 18 and I was conscripted, and I used to judge people by intelligence. And then I was sent to a punishment unit where people with all kinds of issues were sent. I was one of them. And there my observation was that we had people who didn't have first grade education, who were not very bright or very smart, and yet they were willing to put their lives on the line and do the right thing. On the other hand, you had some people who were much, much smarter and were always trying to find a way around so that they can do less work, they can help less, they can risk less, and that they can always have the safest spot so that they are under the least amount of danger, right? So my personal observations, as well as the historical ones by people like Albert Einstein, actually greatly go against what you say, that there is a correlation between intelligence and ethics. In fact, you can build a very strong argument that some of the smartest people in Germany helped the Nazi regime, and in many cases, their high intelligence was something against their ethics, because there comes a point where intelligence prevents compassion. And that's where the Dalai Lama, for example, talks about the fact that ethics for him is compassion, which is very, very different than intelligence. And you can have high degrees of intelligence, and that only makes you more damaging and more dangerous, because instrumentally you can achieve a certain goal, but that can create only a certain degree of higher order of damage rather than helping humanity in any way possible if you're lacking the ethics required to justify that goal in the first place.
So we're going to come on to the question fairly soon as to where we're going to get these ethics from. If it's not just by having more information, if it's not just by building technology that's going to feed more data to us, how are we going to get this? Let me feed in a couple of comments from the audience, and a comment from Paul Imre, riffing off an idea by the software developer Linus Torvalds, who said a million eyeballs makes all bugs transparent. And what Paul is saying, a million eyeballs might lead to wisdom. If there are more people seeing things, we might get greater wisdom in that way. Ted Howard comments, it seems that technology allows us to do advanced modeling, allows us to see that ethics is a necessary boundary condition for the survival. David Doherty suggests that the vaccinations we give to the children are an example where we're using technology to improve how ethical we are as a society, because we're preventing people from being ill. You may or may not want to respond to any of these points, but let's go to you next, Seth, and then we'll come back to Kim.
Okay, so I very much agree with what Nikolai said about compassion being a basis for ethics, but we have been using the term ethics here over and over again without giving it any sort of definition, operational or rigorous whatsoever. So I'm going to go with human flourishing as my definition of what ethical means from now on. This can be extended to all sentient life on the planet. That's completely fine. If the question was, is there any single instance in which science or technology can lead to improvements in ethics, then I would say that yes, there have been many instances where this is the case. Most notably, as I think many of us probably read in Steven Pinker's new book, the ability to collect large amounts of information and analyze them statistically, which would be very difficult for a person to do in their head or by themselves, will give us accurate information as to the state of how people are doing in large populations all over the planet. And having accurate information is necessary for acting ethically in this situation.
But not sufficient. That's my claim. I never said it's not necessary. All I'm saying is it's insufficient. Technology and science are a must. They're very necessary, yet insufficient. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I agree with that.
So what is needed additionally? That we might have the ability, for example, the effective altruism movement is very good at pointing out which interventions seem to have the most impact, best bang for buck in terms of improving human flourishing, rather than just making donors feel nice about themselves. But what's going to make people actually want to study this, and what's going to make people want to promote greater human flourishing rather than just make them feel good about themselves or make them appear good in their peer groups?
Well, as Jay said, increasing intelligence or education actually correlates very strongly with all of these indicators of human flourishing: decrease in violence, decrease in starvation, decrease in war, decrease in accidents over time. Educated countries, wealthier countries, all have lower instances of these terrible afflictions that humanity has had to put up with for nearly its entire existence until what's been called the Great Escape of the Enlightenment, when reason and rational thought and scientific inquiry has allowed us to escape the bonds of low life expectancy, disease states, common famine, states at war all the time. These are just not the case in the world today. Things are changing very rapidly.
Kim, do you agree with the definition that ethics is about steps to improve human flourishing? What are your other comments on what you've been listening to?
I think that's missing the gender side of it. I should point out we're five men talking about these things, and there's a whole other part of the population that actually outnumbers us numerically that we haven't even talked about. And what I have found recently this week, which is fascinating but not very much fun to talk about. So on Tuesday night, I found an NBC report on a beginning Me Too movement in medicine. And I also discovered there were about 40 other links you could find about Me Too in medicine. But the NBC one was the most detailed, the most, convincing that there was a problem, that it was being pursued, and so on. So I posted it on Facebook. Now, I've been on Facebook 11 years. I have never been disciplined in any way by Facebook. So I posted that NBC article on Facebook and went to bed. And the next morning I woke up and went to the computer and found that everything was normal, except that when I tried to post anything on my Facebook wall became dark and I simply couldn't post. The moment I stopped trying to post again, everything was fine. I could visit every part of Facebook that I usually could. I have maybe 2,000 followers on Facebook. Many of them are in medicine, and I can imagine that perhaps some of them are threatened by the idea of a Me Too movement in medicine. Maybe some of them complained, but I would point out to you that what I'm describing was not purely human. I think that something got activated where Facebook decided that this was starting something they didn't want to start. They didn't want wide-ranging discussion about Me Too in medicine because many people were opposed to that. And therefore, they wished me to take that NBC link down. And so I thought about it. I did that after trying on every computer, no matter where I went, I was unable to post to my wall for the first time ever in 11 years. So I took that link down, and within 3 hours, my access was fully back to normal. And so this is a kind of combined human, machine interaction that was actually very smoothly handled. I was less offended than I would have been if somebody had sent me a message, take the darn NBC link down. But then think about this whole thing about ethics. So 48 hours later, so I took the link down, and 48 hours later on CBC, Me Too in Medicine was the lead story on Friday. And they created a half-hour documentary program, which is very well done. And in Canada now, it is, in the past few days, the lead story. So I was onto something. They didn't particularly want this opened, but then it was open. So this is really the area that's at the cutting edge. If you want to look at what ethics are like now for both machines and humans, you can look at what the reaction to, Me Too is.
And are you encouraged by it? Is this a combination of new social thinking and systems like Facebook, which are mediating our discussion? Is that giving you encouragement that we're going to have more flourishing? Or is it something that leaves you pessimistic?
Yeah, I'm afraid you're breaking up for me, so I didn't hear that, David.
Oh, too bad. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
I was asking you if that combination of your experience with Facebook and the Me Too discussion in medicine, has that been an optimistic example for you as to how we're becoming more ethical?
Yeah, I think this is an area of medicine that is greatly in need of addressing. Medicine is very hierarchical, and so you know, there are probably many people who believe that that hierarchy should be exactly the way it is, which means that the people at the top have a lot of power. And so that's an ideal setup for, you know, harassment of women and all the other things that are being complained about in Me Too. So there is much to be done here. I think CBC made the correct decision to make it the top news story, and now it doesn't have anything to do with me because I removed that potent link that I had put up, so there's nothing on my wall that, you know, refers to this at all. But this is an interesting area to study because ethics is all about these questions where there really is no right answer, and it's unclear what we should do in many of these settings, you know? So,
Nikola, what's your view on what you've just heard?
Well, let me just pour some oil into the fire here and say the following. So, 5 white guys talking about ethics, okay? Each one of us has our own narrative. Even if it's a noble narrative, such as human flourishing, this is a very dangerous narrative. It's a narrative that can be deadly and merciless so. So, for example, Seth said he's a humanist. That comes with a narrative. And the narrative goes something like this. And it has profound ethical implications, right? First, it used to be that we had animism. And so we considered ourselves to be as part of the world. So because one day we killed an animal to eat, the next day an animal killed us to eat. We were no better, we were no worse off. The animal had a soul, the tree had a soul, the stone had a soul, we had a soul, and we were all equals. Then we invented deities, gods. And gods were, you know, the almighty, the one and ever-present, omnipotent, all-knowing power in the world. And of course, we were created in the image of God. So we got promoted while animals got demoted. So we were one step underneath God with the potential to grow and live in God's kingdom, whereas the world, including all the animals and all the other living beings, became our garden, therefore for our taking. Then eventually we had humanism with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which properly killed God and immediately replaced him with us. So now we are becoming the gods. And this is the narrative that we can observe throughout time, right? So after the humanist narrative, then we have, of course, the transhumanist narrative, and then the post-human narrative, which takes us from humans to transhumans and to post-humans. But the key is that it used to be the case where it was a decentralized world. Then it becomes centralized with God at the center of it. Then we killed God and we became the center of it. So now let's talk about this statement, human flourishing, right? Very ethical statement, very profoundly good. But not if you're one of those 75 billion animals, not if you're one of those 1.3 trillion fish or other aquatic organisms, not if you're an alien from space, another sentient being from another planet, not if you're an artificial intelligence, because you're interested only with a very speciesistic, which is to say racist in a way, single species flourishing, human flourishing, right? Which is why we go back to the original point that Kim brought.
I could address that, David.
Which is to say 5 white guys talking about technology and ethics. Each one of us has our own narrative, and those narratives can be incredibly dangerous and incredibly deadly, however well-intentioned they may be.
Actually, I see a transhumanist narrative as becoming pan-human. So I mean, if we are talking about altering ourselves and changing who we are biologically and technologically, then the concern becomes not, you know, us versus the animals, but sentient beings in general. So I think one of the fundamental truths or that any philosopher realizes soon enough is that the only thing that really matters in the world is consciousness. I mean, if you're not conscious, then it's just an inanimate process. It's like a clock ticking away, and it doesn't matter what happens. But we are now, as a species, becoming more sensitive to other conscious beings. And the issue of developing super intelligent AI now raises the issue of whether or not machines can become conscious. So I think if you look at the transhumanist narrative, we're going beyond human, and we're looking at we're actually more sensitive to what it means to suffer, and how beings of all different kinds can suffer, and that's going to then force us, of course, to think more ethically and to you know, prevent suffering from happening. So if you look at synthetic meat, for example, right? I mean, okay, let's not kill the fish, let's not kill the animals, let's find ways of creating protein in a way that doesn't involve causing cause suffering to others. So I think technology is the solution to this, and I think the development of technology is forcing us to become more ethical in a way that goes beyond what it means to be human.
But you see, this is one perfect example where we absolutely do not need technology to resolve the problem. So we know that today we're killing 75 billion animals, right? We know that 70% of the soy and corn grown in the world goes to feed cattle. We know that. Those are facts. We know that there's billions of cattle there. We know that one cattle is worth 4 or 5 cars. We know that methane is 22 times more reactive than CO2. We know all of those things scientifically. We know that today humanity can actually sustain 14 billion people without any change in technology whatsoever, but by doing something much harder, evidently, which is to say, to change its habits, right, or traditions, and to move to a plant-based diet. We need zero technology. We have the science, and we know that we kill ourselves in the West because we have the greatest obesity epidemic. We have explosion of diabetes. We have the destruction of the Amazon forest. We have the disappearance of species or the sixth extinction. We have all kinds of things which can be directly traced to that particular choice to raise cattle, to feed people, etc., etc. And we know that we don't need to do that for health or for calories or for our survival. We don't need artificial meat in 10 years to do the right thing today. And yet we're not doing it because we are avoiding our personal responsibility and trying to surrender that to technology and to ethics. And by the way, I don't know of a single case or any speck of evidence whatsoever that we have any improvement of machine consciousness whatsoever. The only thing that we have made progress so far in is in machine intelligence. But zero, I repeat, zero evidence that I'm aware of any machine consciousness progress. Zero.
Seth, maybe you want to comment on some of that, either on how your statement holds up, that ethics means human flourishing, when you've heard various counterpoints to that, that we should be thinking pan-humanistically or thinking in terms of all sentient conscious beings, and any thoughts perhaps on artificial consciousness?
Yes, many. Okay, so I'll start with the point of human flourishing. So that's a very surface definition of humanism. When I say human, I don't mean human as in Homo sapien. I mean human as in conscious or sentient or sapient. So a better definition, as Nikolai said earlier, compassion. The imperative should be to reduce suffering across anything that's sentient across the planet. And we do have the technology and the ability to transport and to feed everybody on the planet, including at least twice the population with what we have available to us now. And it's nothing less than a scandal that we have not decided collectively to do this. The opprobrium, the moral opprobrium is on us and only us, because we have not all decided to do this.
So why haven't we decided to do it? What's holding us up from making that? Nikola was suggesting it's just we're somehow wrongly configured, or that we're putting things off for no good reason. What's your view as to why we haven't made that decision?
Momentum. People are used to living like this. People don't want to change. It's very difficult for people to think in new ways. It's going to be expensive. Certainly not as expensive as maintaining things the way they are now. More education, more people who are able to contribute to knowledge and decreased suffering will improve everybody's condition on the planet, including the animals. But for your point about artificial consciousness, I would say, yes, there is absolutely no such thing as artificial consciousness at this point. We don't even have a good definition of what consciousness is. And as far as plant-based protein being acceptable, so I guess only things that have nervous systems are able to suffer. So bacteria and protists, algae, we can just kill them as we please with no moral stain on us whatsoever.
Well,
okay. Just a call out to the audience. I'm seeing some great comments in the discussion board. It's also useful if you can post short questions that I can feed directly to the panel. So if you've had a think about the flow of discussions already in the audience, please come up with the killer question to help the discussion move forwards. So who in the panel would like to speak next on the subject of should we be supporting this drive to abolish suffering in all sentient beings? Should we become supporters of David Pearce's abolitionist project? Is that the future of ethics? Or, and if we are just thinking about human flourishing in the narrow sense of Homo sapiens, then we are just as guilty as racists were in the past.
If I can take this challenge here again, and the reason why I'm bringing it up is not simply to talk about animal welfare, but to talk about us included, by the way. Because if a greater intelligence, whether artificial in its origin or whether of alien origin, regardless, if a greater intelligence takes the same ethical modus operandi that we are using today, we are dead or enslaved or nearly extinct. Because our current guiding moral principle is this: I am smarter than you, or I'm more intelligent than you, as Jay would say, and therefore I can enslave you and I can kill you and I can eat you, or I can kill you for sport. And this is what we're doing. As I said, 75 billion animals we're killing each year, 1.3 trillion fish and aquatic organisms, and we know this is not sustainable. And we know that there's a good chance in the near future we may stop being the smartest kid on the block. And if those smartest species treat us the way we treat the great apes, the elephants, the whales, or it doesn't matter, because we know that there's hundreds of sentient species out there, and yet that doesn't seem to help us treat them any better. So if we are treated the way we treat the animals, we have no chance. And I think the only thing we can do is we can hope to be treated with dignity and respect by greater intelligences. And to do that, we have to set a precedent by treating other sentient species in kind, which is to say with dignity and respect.
Kim?
So I wanted to just point out that there's a simpler kind of equity to think about, and that is how we are going to treat sentient machines when they exist. You can talk about consciousness. You don't believe they'll be conscious, but whatever they are, they'll be smarter than we are. They can communicate with us. They can at least simulate consciousness, even if you technically believe that they're not conscious, and they'll be much better at practically everything than we are. So as you may know, in 2015, January, there was a meeting in Puerto Rico about what to do about this. There were 98 people there, 97 of which thought we should enslave sentient AI. And then Rich Sutton from here, who was the only person from the University of Alberta, thought we should treat sentient AI as equals in an empathetic way. And actually, if you think about it, it's very simple. That doesn't have to be the top idea. It doesn't have to be the idea that wins out. But as long as that idea survives of treating sentient machines as equals, including them in our circle of empathy, then we will probably survive, because they'll say, look, this good idea is there. And if it doesn't survive, if the other 97 people somehow completely, extinguish Rich Sutton's idea about this, then we will not survive, because the machines are smarter than we are, and they'll know that the uniform plan is to lie to them, for instance, telling them that we're all vegan when we're not, and to enslave them. So they cannot have agency. So it comes down to something very simple. It's not that the idea has to be uniformly accepted or that has to be the top idea, but as long as the idea is always there, then we will probably survive. And if it's not there, we won't. And the future and all that jazz, some of you are aware that we have taken unpleasant ideas that people don't like to listen to in lecture form and put them into poetry and music. And actually, David Wood was quite central in the success of this, because in London, UK, he brought people to hear us at the Vortex Jazz Cafe. That's working very well, and it's necessary for exactly the reason that many of you may not enjoy what I have just said. If we put it in poetry and music, we could entertain you for an evening and still get the idea across. So that's what we're doing.
Jay.
Yeah, so I just like to make a few points. First of all, is this difference between knowing what is right and doing what is right, because often as human beings, we have the first but not the second. So we're dealing with an issue here of motivation or compassion. And as human beings, we often have knowledge and emotion sort of compartmentalized, and they interact, but they're somewhat different brain systems. I think however, if you look at motivation and emotion, it's something that can also be programmed. It's also something that can be formalized and understood. So knowing what is right, yes, let's work on that. Let's try to solve that as a problem. But then this separate issue of how you implement it, of how you provide sufficient motivation when you're talking about a society of people or a society of machines, or some relation, some sort of symbiotic relation between the two. And the issue of second is the issue of consciousness. And I think that this is very difficult problem, because we all know that we're conscious, but we can't prove it in any way other than our behavior, by saying that we are, or by acting in a way as if we are. So if we're talking about machine consciousness, or the consciousness of other beings like animals, and we want to assess how we treat them, it's problematic to say the least. So we don't have a good operating definition of consciousness, and if a machine tells us that all of a sudden, hey, I'm just like you guys, how do you believe it? And so it's a very complex issue, and it's something that I think we need to be working on. Is there some sort of
very simple
measure
issue,
of?
actually. If you take the teachings of the Dalai Lama again, how do you know if something is conscious? Well, can it feel any pain? To me, that's a pretty simple definition. So,
but how do you know?
Are you causing pain and suffering to an animal that you're taking to the slaughterhouse? Yes. Can you see visible signs? Yes. Can you measure all kinds of brain outputs, hormones, etc., that show that the animals are in stress? Yes. Is there a lot of science that we can do to prove all of those things with respect to animal welfare? Absolutely. And there's a fantastic video that I recommend people check out by Yuval Harari called "The Role of Scientists in the Debate About Animal Welfare," where he goes through all those points, and they're pretty much scientifically settled already.
Yeah, well, but the only thing you have to go on is behavioral measures, objective behavioral measures. So you're looking at brain activity, or you're looking at the machine state activity, or you're looking at what somebody does or what somebody says. But those are not foolproof ways of assessing whether something is capable of suffering. Because I could tell you, hold on, I could tell you right now that I'm suffering. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I mean, I'm not. All I'm trying to do is say that this is a problem. It's something that we need to work on, and going forward, it's going to be more of a problem when you know, we're dealing with multiple types of sentience, sapience, and
I agree with you. But what I'm saying is that at least it's a good starting point to say, is it capable of experiencing suffering? And if the answer is yes, then therefore it's sentient, and therefore has consciousness, and therefore we, on moral and ethical grounds, we should not be the cause of that suffering if we can help avoiding it.
Nikola, let me put to you a question from Didier Cornell, who's watching. He says, why is it so important to particularly look at the impact of humans on animals and the animals that suffer because we kill them? Isn't there a much larger suffering in the animal kingdom in any case, just because animals are killing animals?
Of course, and that's like saying, look, there are murderers and thieves all over the world. Why don't we be murderers and thieves? We bear responsibilities for our own actions. And if we are claiming to be, as humanism would say, the peak of the ladder, we are the highest intelligence on our planet. We are the center and the measure of all things. And we are the gods who basically decide what species would go extinct or how or when, and what habitat would be destroyed, etc. Then we'd better take responsibility for our actions. Yes, there will be animals that kill animals. Sure, I don't control other people's actions, just like I don't control other animals' actions. All I can control is my own choices and my own actions, and I'm responsible ethically and morally, therefore, only for those. But that also goes at the aggregate level for our whole civilization.
Okay, I think, by the way, Yuval Harari, who you've also mentioned, somebody who has written a lot on this, that's the Israeli historian and philosopher. He has figures in which he points out that the large animals which exist in by far the largest numbers are actually the farm animals that we humans are creating, and that the other animals that we often see in nature programs and television are present actually in much smaller quantities.
There are more tigers in Texas than there are tigers in the wild. Okay, in Texas, they're usually in private properties and farms and stuff like that. So if you add all the wild tigers in the world, there's less of them than there are tigers in Texas.
So I want to move on to the question of the future then. If science and technology by itself is not going to make us into better beings with a greater sense of responsibility for all creatures that might suffer real pain, what is going to make the difference? What's going to change between now and, say, 10 or 20 years' time to improve circumstances?
Is that to me, Dave?
That's to anybody who wants. I think we should all chip in with comments on that.
Well, I think the analogy, I mean, if you think about supporting diversity and fairness and so on, and include sentient machines in that, we are going to be more and more faced with the question of whether we're going to do that. And that is then going to be indefensible for us to treat sentient machines well, while we're causing all these other beings to suffer. So
What's
I
gonna
think
change?
that's one way in which future, technology will enhance the focus on that particular question and probably lead to its at least partial solution.
Seth?
What was the question exactly?
What's going to change if it's not just science and technology that's going to make us into better beings with a greater moral concern for all sentient beings? What should be done in the next 5 or 10 years to change to actually change human practice?
It's a very specific question. Well, increasing education, as I said before, the more intelligent, the more affluent, and the better off nations are as a whole, the less damage, the less pain they seem to cause overall. But people were talking before about hypothetical superintelligences being able to come and guide us, maybe being super ethical, or you can use the superintelligence definition that it's some sort of intelligent agent that can exceed all human domains of cognition by orders of magnitude, maybe by many, many orders of magnitude. And then if we begin to try to, kind of psychoanalyze a godlike intellect, like we're assuming by definition, it's useless. There's nothing we can say about that, really. So like hoping that a super intelligence that we happen to invent, and I personally have a bit of a, let's say bias. I have a lot of respect for artificial intelligence. I have such respect for artificial intelligence that I don't like to use the term artificial intelligence to refer to the things that exist today. So what exists today is machine learning. We don't even have a good operational definition of what intelligence is. So it's not the artificial part that I have a problem with, it's the intelligence part. Okay, we don't know what intelligence is. We have numerous operational definitions. Many are in disagreement with each other. But the idea that we're just going to, ex nihilo create godlike consciousness, intelligence, something with, a godlike ability to suffer infinitely, we should not pin our hopes on something like this. As Nikola said.
I would just add to that. So it sounds to me like the question was if it's a non-technological change or a technological change. So if it's not,
technology will work, but if there's more to be done, what is it?
Well, I mean, I think we actually, I think the news always portrays like the absolute worst about what's happening at any given moment in time. So I think people tend to be very negative and pessimistic about where we're going forward, where humanity is going to be. But actually, I mean, if you look at the work that Steven Pinker has done, there are many indications that, in fact, things are better than they ever have been. In fact, this is the best time to have ever lived in all of human existences right now. We have democracy around the world. We have increased standard of living. We have high levels of education. If we're talking about like a non-technological change, I think you can just look around you to say that education, tolerance for diversity. I live in New York City, and people here they don't have zero intolerance, but they're very tolerant. I mean, you see people of all stripes and colors living next to one another. So I think the more we are exposed to one another, the more we learn about the world, the more we learn about other people, the more empathetic we become. And so I would say that we need to learn to develop sympathy and empathy. I mean, these are two important characteristics. And we also need to reduce hate. I mean, we need to examine like what makes people hate. Like why does a person become racist? Why does a person become a white supremacist? Psychology and sociology and and science are now having a lot of better insights into these problems and how you can solve them. I mean, these are engineering problems. If somebody is violent and hateful, that there's a dysfunction in their brain and endocrine system, and that's something that can be fixed.
So, Nicola, what I've heard in answer to the question so far is that we need more education, and if we're more educated, we'll be better informed as to the consequences of our choices. I've also heard that if we reflect on the fact that there might be artificially general intelligence that is coming soon that is more intelligent than us, this will cause us a Copernican shift in our thinking, and it will make us reflect more seriously on our ethical responsibilities in turn towards others. There's a point that's been raised by Ted Howard on the audience who says that another change in perspective will come when people realize they might live much longer than they're currently expecting to. And instead of thinking they're likely to die in a few decades, if they realize there's a good chance they could live hundreds of years, that might change their perspective as well. And we've heard from Jay just now about the possibilities of learning more about psychology. This is the particular field that we should study more. And if we study psychology, we'll learn why we are resistant against the changes in nature that would make for a much more flourishing environment for everybody. So which of these would you choose, or would you choose something else instead?
Well, let me weave those themes together and see if I can bring them to a new point. So first of all, let's take the issue of artificial intelligence. So just like Seth, I have very, very high respect for artificial intelligence, despite the fact that we don't have a very good definition of it, but I have zero respect for artificial ethics. It's something that's never existed in the past, to my awareness. It's something that we've made zero to no progress that I'm aware of, or that I've seen any evidence. So you cannot expect artificial intelligence to take ethical decisions if we don't even know what artificial intelligence is, if we've never even considered artificial ethics. Therefore, the hope that some kind of artificial general intelligence would come and save us out of our own predicament is again avoiding the responsibility and pushing it away to someone bigger and better and smarter and wiser than us. And my whole point of writing that original article, Technology is Not Enough, and writing it sort of in your face, is to challenge people to actually take charge of that responsibility, to actually realize that we must look into the mirror, that there's no one else coming to save us, that we're the only agents, at least right now, on this planet, and we have the opportunity to save us or to destroy us and everyone else together with that. And let me give you an example. Let's say an amazing artificial general superintelligence exists and comes and tomorrow says, well, I have an ethical resolution to all the problems on planet Earth. And the answer is, we exterminate the human race. It's the best decision with the highest utilitarian outcome that would have, the least suffering caused of all sentient species on our planet, right? Would we then have the right to resist such an artificial general intelligence, or do we have to go by it simply because it's more intelligent and it's smarter than us and it knows better than us, right? So we cannot simply abdicate our own responsibility as moral agents. We never can. It's like you are born with them the moment that you are an intelligent, rational agent. And then how do we correct this then? So we heard many suggestions. My suggestion is the following. We need a new narrative, which is why the book that I was writing and is still very far from ready, and I only have a vague idea about it. But basically, we need to rewrite the human story because the future is derived from our story. So humanism as a narrative has a direct impact and responsibility of where we are today, of our predicaments today. Just like, the deism or theism before humanism had direct impact and responsibility of the Dark Ages and everything that was or a large degree of what was happening in the human civilization at that point in time, and so on and so on. And so we need a new narrative. And there's a number of, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and other reasons why that's the case. So, for example, our brains have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to transmit knowledge, and that goes in support of the idea of better education. But how was the original education happening in the world? Well, basically, we would gather around the fire, and the old men of the tribe would tell stories to the young men of the tribe. And those stories would be about the passing of the seasons, the migration of the herds, or whatever, things that meant life or death back in those days. So our brains have evolved to actually transmit and accumulate knowledge through narratives, through stories, but also so have our identities, which is where racism, sexism, xenophobism, and all those isms come from a narrative that you embrace as your own identity and then breaking the world into us versus them. So basically we need a new narrative, and that would be an ethical narrative, but that would also be a political narrative, which is why I very much agree with David that we need to transcend politics. We need a trans-political, a politics that transcends politics, a new kind of politics. But at the core of every political movement, whether it's, feminism, whether it's communism, whether it's capitalism, whether it's the anti-slavery movement, or what have you, you have a certain narrative that everything is built for. And so first, we have to come up with this good narrative that can galvanize people, mobilize them to take action and to change their habits and to start and turn a new page. And that's what I've been struggling with, to be honest, for the last year maybe. And I'm unhappy to report that I haven't made too much progress on it, but I've made a little bit, but not enough.
Yeah, I would ask, what is transcending politics? What does that mean? Who would be in charge? Who decides what is political or trans-political, or how is this applied to groups of people?
Well, David perhaps can say something about that.
Well, this is a big topic, but I think it's got to be all humans should be involved in this discussion. The grand discussion, which has sometimes taken place just among elites in the past, that's no longer feasible. And what I look forward to is not just a democracy, but a super democracy in which the great understanding of the whole of humanity, all of our diverse groups, is shared, and we can realize out of that collective wisdom which are the things that we most need to progress. I'd love to talk about this more fully, but I'm aware that we're quite short of time now. And so what I want to do is, I think Nikola set this up very interestingly, is suggesting that the way we're going to move forward from this isn't just by technology in its own right, nor is it simply by educating people in the same as before. We actually need a new narrative, that the old narratives which we've got are insufficient, and that when people say, oh, let's get back to some golden age, that's also inadequate because it's based on a misunderstanding what happened in the past, and it underplays all the terrible things that were wrong in the past. When people say, make America great again, or let's make Britain great again, it's similarly a wrong narrative. So what would each of you panelists, if you would like to try and draw some of your thoughts together, what would you feature in this new narrative? The narrative, as Nikola says, which must be based on insights from evolutionary biology, amongst other things. So, Jay, perhaps I can get you to kick off that discussion.
Sure. I mean, I would say that the narrative is actually already here. It's not so new. It's been starting with the Renaissance. It involves science, reason, objectivity. It also is democracy, participatory democracy. And these principles and systems are being facilitated by technology. So we can communicate with other people more easily than ever before. We can exchange ideas better than ever before. We can apply technology to these things. So I would say that if you want a new narrative, that narrative is science, technology, humanism, reason. These things have been around. We just need to acknowledge that they're important and utilize them. We get swamped in competing discussions of things, when in fact, if we stand back, we can see what has worked. Right? Science works. Democracy has worked. These things have been beneficial. They've been immensely helpful. And so I would say those are the not so new narratives. They are the narratives that we need to stay with.
So it's not a brand new narrative as such. It's recognizing some of the real strengths of human history and encouraging these strengths to come to the fore as never before. So we'll get to, if you like, a Humanity Plus, a Humanity version 2.0 and beyond, by the best natures of Humanity 1.0. Who'd like to?
Yeah, I can
final
speak.
remarks.
I think it comes down to something. The new narrative has to have a new flavor. It's true that it's based on exactly what the other panelists have been saying, but it's also based on the fact that increasingly we are creating robots and sentient machines that we're programming. We need to program ethics into them, and we don't know what that input should be now because we don't have a good enough understanding of ethics and ethical principles themselves. So the new narrative would go from the situation we're in now, where we don't understand ethics well enough to make it formulaic kind of thing that one could inform sentient machines about, to a point where we do understand it better and we know in more detail what kinds of decision making we would like future sentient machines to be able to engage in. That is really the only logical future. It's not really that we take the enlightenment of centuries in the past and just move it forward a little bit. That's fine, but we also need to make it programmable into machines, and then we'll really have something. And ultimately, they'll be better at this than we are, better at ethics, better at politics, better at democracy, better at taking actions in support of the long-term interests of all of us. So
yeah, I agree completely, actually. I mean, these things have to be formalized. So, I mean, if you see these as problems, they can be represented, they can be computed upon, they can be simulated in different kinds of algorithmic models. We have some really interesting tools at our disposal now, things like multi-agent systems where you can actually like run a model, communist economy, and compare it against a capitalist one and see which parameters do better. I mean, if going forward with superintelligence, these kinds of things are going to be useful for us to solve these kinds of problems. So we will have computational tools in the next century that we haven't even dreamed of yet, and those are going to be very powerful. But at the same time, I'm saying we should not ignore these fundamental principles that we already know about.
And Jay, whilst you've got the microphone, so to speak, can you comment on what Nikola said earlier, that there is no progress in artificial ethics? Wouldn't you perhaps point to work done by the IEEE in terms of their systems for ethical use of AI, or even the conference that Kim Solis mentioned, the one in Puerto Rico in January 2015, and the one more recently in Asilomar, when as a result of this, a lot more work has been done on safety of AI systems and the foundations, perhaps, of the AI ethics for the future? Yeah,
I mean, we're just getting to the whole field of machine ethics has just emerged in the past decade. And I can't think of, there are examples, they're not immediately coming to mind, but we're just at this point where it's sort of a cusp here where we're being able to develop ethics in using computational approaches. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see, for example, algorithms being used to sort of deal with human level conflicts, of any sort. So I'm confident that this stuff is kicking in. I mean, Nikola's comment is correct in the sense that it's like, yeah, there's no example there. We're getting there. So if we were having this conversation 10 years from now, we would have many, many more examples to go off of. But my prediction is that this is an area of super ethics that, like superintelligence, is going to take off in the near future.
Seth, closing remarks and thoughts from you.
Yeah, I would just say that I think, a form of super democracy, like you mentioned, it would be desirable for the planet as a whole. And information technology would allow something like this to happen, maybe specifically blockchain technology or something else, but giving everybody a voice and giving everybody the ability to have an informed voice across the planet would be desirable for everybody. So, Spinoza said that he who is guided by ethics wishes nothing for himself that he does not wish for all. And we also must respect the limits of our own knowledge. So our ignorance is infinite compared to what we know. And if we don't have respect for this, we're just asking for trouble. So I'll leave you with one final quote from the ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi. He said that to let knowledge stop where knowledge cannot be understood, this is a high attainment. Those who cannot do this will be destroyed upon the lathe of heaven.
And Nikola, for your closing remarks, is it the case that you would accept that some of the principles of science, reason, objectivity, and so on from the Enlightenment are indeed desirable, but the one missing ingredient is urgency? And we have to have more urgency than ever before in these discussions, partly because of the technological power we've got and partly because of the pace of change. And that's why it's even more important that we address these questions now. Or what else would you like to have people thinking about as they leave this conversation?
I agree that urgency is important because now we're playing with the most powerful tools we have ever had in the history of our civilization. But it's not only about urgency, it's about ethics, because as I keep saying, technology is not enough. And the reason for that is, and actually people just gave more evidence, the Asilomar conference, for example, is not about artificial ethics. It's about applying human ethics in the realm of artificial intelligence, and is a mere copy of an original conference that happened there 4 years ago when it was about biological and other genetic manipulation and so on, where ethical principles or ethical guidelines were created. And so the second Asilomar conference, which was about artificial intelligence, merely imitated the first one and took some of the original guidelines, which are very good human, medical, or other research ethical guidelines to be applied across a diversity of fields. So they're not machine ethics, or they're not artificial intelligence ethics, because they don't originate in AI or machines, they originate with us and in us. Now, what's my parting message? My parting message is technology is not enough, because technology is merely the how. It's not the why and it's not the what. Technology is a tool to an end. It is merely a means to an end. It is how we get things, but it's not the things we want to get in the first place. And that's very important distinction. So science and technology are the most powerful tools that humanity has ever had in our hands. And they can destroy us or they can save us. They can help us go extinct like the dinosaurs, or they can help us populate the universe like Carl Sagan and Elon Musk dream of. But whether we get to one end of the spectrum or to the other end of the spectrum will not depend on science or technology, but it will depend on us, because we are the ethical agents and we are the only ones who can make that choice. And we better take charge of it and make it, because it's not going to happen on its own. And so once of all, technology is the how, it's not the why and the what. Technology is not enough. And the path to our destruction or to our salvation may be science and technology, but it will not be the reason as per why we get there. And so we always ought to start with why, which is the ethical question. And the world is transformed by asking questions, by the way. And the how, the tool, the technology and the science would only come useful afterwards. Because if you have the wrong how, or if you have the wrong why or the wrong what, even if you have the best how, then you can only do more damage. Just like we can give you many, many examples from history of World War II in Germany and Berlin and etc., etc. So we need to start with the proper what and the proper why, and only then the how.
This has been such an interesting discussion. If people are listening and they would like to be pointed at things where they could follow up some of the ideas being discussed, would panelists, 20 seconds maximum, would like to recommend any possible reading? And to kick off, I must say I am reading Steven Pinker's Enlightenment now. I'm only a quarter of the way through it, but it is better than I expected it to be, a lot better. And almost everything I've read so far has made me nod my head and say, yes, this is progressing this discussion forwards. So what else would people like to recommend to readers to take? Seth?
Yeah, I got a couple recommendations. An older book that's very good is called Unto Others by Sober and Wilson, where they look at the problem of altruism and how it could possibly evolve.
Unto Others.
Unto Others by Elliot Sober and David Wilson. David Sloan Wilson.
Right, it's an evolutionary biology and altruism. Yes.
Yeah. Another would be Big Mind by Jeff Mulligan, The Wisdom of Crowds, The Million Eyes. It's a very, very thorough investigation into this phenomenon.
So he's the CEO of Nesta in Britain, and that, yeah, looking at not just human intelligence or not just machine intelligence, but systems that allow both intelligences to magnify and support each other.
Yes, absolutely. You said Enlightenment now already, obviously, and Better Angels of Our Nature. Oh, okay. And 2014 Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom. Highly recommend that one.
Yeah, I was also going to recommend Nick Bostrom's book. It's a little technically dense, and for the layperson requires a little bit of effort to get through, but it's definitely worth it. I would also recommend Max Tegmark's Life 3.0, which gives you a sort of far future perspective. And of course, I'm going to make a shameless plug here. Humanity's Future, How Technology Will Change Us.
Who wrote that, Jay?
By none other than yours truly, which is pretty much just a general summary of how technology can benefit us and in many different areas such as economics, politics, medicine, space exploration, etc.
Kim?
So I would support all of those, but I also feel, as I said before, that the Millennium Project State of the Future book, you can get the one from the year that you're in. So if you wait long enough, there'll be 2018 out with brand new stuff, and you can personally contribute. And the other thing you can take part in is our YouTube channel, just youtube.com/user/Kim Soles. And you'll find new stuff related to what we talked about here, at least every week, and sometimes every day. Sometimes we've had like 3 videos a day. So it's a very, very prolific YouTube channel, and you can comment on things there. And I look forward to staying in contact with you about this wonderful things we've talked about today.
Nikola.
Well, I have to say I'm reading David's Transcending Politics, which is an utterly phenomenal book that I recommend that everyone should read. I've only read the first 60 pages, but I've been thoroughly impressed, and I plan to read the whole thing before we do an interview on Singularity FM devoted specifically for the book, because I think it's a pivotal, crucial piece. Because as you argue in the beginning of the book, the path to salvation or destruction of humanity goes through politics. And so we can get everything right, and if we get the politics wrong, we can destroy ourselves. So we must get politics right if we are to make a difference and if we are to save ourselves and the world. But in addition, so that's my plug for your book. It's phenomenal work, David. Now, I'm not going to stop there, though. I would say everyone should read Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens. Homo Deus is okay, but Sapiens was the original book that's much better in my opinion. And then finally, we should all go back to the roots and read some of the Chinese Eastern philosophers, but in the West, we should do with Plato's dialogues, and also people such as Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, Seneca, and Lucretius. So the Stoic school of philosophy, the Platonic school of philosophy, the Epicureans, I think all of them have tremendous ethics, especially the Stoics. but all of them too, and tremendous lessons that we can take from their age and plug it in today in our daily lives. So, for example, even if you take something like Letters from a Stoic as a book, as you read those letters, you would not know that they were written by somebody who wrote them 2,000 years ago, if you ignore the names, which are, you know, Roman names and Latin sounding and all of that. But if you focus on the content, you would not know someone wrote that 2,000 years ago. That's how lasting it is. That's how powerful it is. And that's how important it is not to forget that, but to keep going there, in my opinion.
And that reminds me of a book which I have recommended many times to people. It's a book about finding modern truth in ancient wisdom. The actual title of the book is The Happiness Hypothesis. It's written by a professor of moral psychology called Jonathan Haidt. It looks at many of the philosophers that Nikola and others have mentioned, and usually talks about them in a very enlightening way. It's not the same as reading the originals, but if you don't have time to read all the originals, this is a good starting point. The Happiness Hypothesis: how we can indeed have not just superficial happiness, but deep, lasting happiness in a way that isn't just for ourselves, but for all humans, and as we transhumanists would say, for all sentient beings into the future light con. Thanks very much to all of you for being great participants. We are over the time limit, so I'm going to shut down the broadcast now and invite people to keep an eye on London Futurists for more hangouts and more real-world meetings. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.